Sleep has become a stranger to me these days, an elusive thing that slips through my fingers no matter how desperately I reach for it. And while the divorce papers still sit on my kitchen table, staring up at me like a monument to the life that's crumbled around me over the past few months, they're not the sole reason for my restless nights. There's something else here in Ridgewood, an intangible presence that presses down on my shoulders and transforms the silence into something almost animate, as though it's observing me with unseen eyes. My name is Roran, I'm 47 years old, and since everything fell apart, I've been living alone in a cramped apartment, nestled in the heart of the city, a modest space where the single-room sofa creaks loudly with every shift of my weight. The kitchen houses a stove that groans with sounds reminiscent of a weary soul, and the bedroom holds a narrow bed that only amplifies the sense of futility I carry around like a second skin. From the window, I can see a slender street below, where the streetlights flicker erratically, casting shadows that sometimes appear to dance on their own, independent of any source I can pinpoint. By day, I toil away at adjusting insurance policies in an office just a few blocks from here, a job so steeped in monotony that it barely registers as anything more than a means to keep the bills paid, or at least what's left of them, after my ex-wife claimed her half of everything we once shared. Friends are a rarity for me now. Their numbers dwindled to almost nothing, and I spend most of my hours trying to keep my mind from wandering too far into the abyss. Though lately that effort has proven futile. Ridgewood might seem ordinary at first glance, with its neatly aligned streets and weathered brick buildings standing as silent sentinels of time. Yet beneath that facade lingers an unease I can't quite name, a tension that coils around me like a living thing, as if the very air is poised on the brink of something momentous. My son Lasek remains the one tether keeping me anchored to anything resembling reality, a 24-year-old who joined the military straight out of high school at 19, and now carries himself with the broad-shouldered confidence of a man shaped by discipline. His work is a mystery to me, cloaked in vague phrases like classified security that he tosses out whenever I press for details, his expression shutting down as firmly as a locked door. He's tall, his hair cropped so precisely it might have been measured with a straight edge, and though he inherited his mother's deep brown eyes, the quiet seriousness in his demeanour mirrors my own, a trait we share despite the distance that's grown between us. Our conversations are sparse, and though I often think of dialing his number just to let his voice pierce the oppressive stillness of my apartment, I falter every time, unsure of what words could bridge the gap between us, both of us too stubborn or too reserved to indulge in idle chatter. Still, pride swells in me when I think of him, even if I've never found a way to express it aloud. Upstairs dwells a man named Nevik, a figure I know only because I once glimpsed his name on a faded, yellowed envelope discarded in the hallway. An envelope adorned with seals that seemed oddly anachronistic, as if they belonged to another era entirely. He's an enigmatic presence, a taciturn individual with a scruffy beard and eyes that always slide away from mine whenever our paths cross, which is mercifully rare. His footsteps echo through the ceiling at odd hours, deliberate and heavy, suggesting he's hauling something burdensome across the floorboards, though I've never dared to ask what it might be. In this building, everyone keeps to themselves, tending to their own fractured lives, or at least attempting to. And I have no inclination to disrupt that unspoken agreement. Ridgewood isn't the kind of place you'd feature on a postcard. Its streets paved with cracked asphalt, its corner stores peddling lukewarm coffee, and its buildings exuding an exhaustion that comes from decades of standing upright against the elements. Yet there's an undercurrent here that defies explanation, a strangeness that clings to the city like a second shadow, and I suspect much of it emanates from a Velda's propulsion, that sprawling industrial complex of concrete and steel sprawling across the city's edge like a wound that never quite heals. People talk about it in hushed tones, aware of its existence but uncertain of its purpose, with rumours swirling that they're developing experimental aerospace technology, perhaps even crafting vessels to colonise distant planets. Though others whisper darker theories about meddling with forces better left undisturbed. I've overheard barroom tales of peculiar lights spilling from the facility under cover of night, illumination that didn't conform to anything natural, but I'd always dismissed them as drunken exaggerations, until recently that is. Velda's cast a long, ominous shadow over Ridgewood, one you can't help but feel, even if you try to ignore it. And the employees, those few who ever venture into public, move with a mechanical efficiency, their badges dangling around their necks like markers of ownership. An aura surrounds that place, a blend of secrecy and peril that suggests they're tampering with something volatile. And whenever I pass by on my way home from work, I'd swear the temperature drops noticeably, even on the warmest summer evenings, a sensation too consistent to chalk up to mere imagination. It's not just Velders, though. The entire city carries an odd energy, a stillness that descends at unexpected moments and strips away the ambient hum you'd expect from any urban sprawl. Unlike other cities where the soundscape is a constant symphony of passing cars, distant sirens or muffled shouts, Ridgewood sometimes falls into an absolute hush, as though someone flipped a switch to mute the world, and I've woken in the dead of night to that suffocating quiet, my pulse racing for reasons I can't articulate. It feels as if the city itself is bracing for an event just beyond the horizon, and lately, I've been gripped by the unshakable sense that whatever it is looms closer than ever before. I can't pinpoint what jolted me awake that night, whether it was the insistent buzz of my phone vibrating against the bedside table or the sudden chill that seemed to slither through the room, as though an unseen hand had cracked open a window I knew was securely latched. My head throbbed with the dull ache of exhaustion, the kind that settles in after hours of chasing sleep without success, and my eyes stung as I fumbled blindly in the darkness to grasp the device. The screen's glow seared my vision for a moment, but when I saw the name displayed there, Lasek, my stomach twisted into a tight knot, because it was 1:47 a.m, and my son isn't the type to call at such an hour without cause. "Dad," his voice sliced through the silence before I could even muster a greeting, steady, yet laced with a strain I hadn't heard since he'd phoned years ago to announce he'd survived basic training. "Turn on the TV, now," he commanded, his words carrying the weight of an order rather than a suggestion, leaving no room for hesitation. Still groggy, I struggled to process what he meant, my tongue tripping over a half-formed question. "Lasek, what's—" But he cut me off sharply with, "Now, Dad," and the urgency in his tone propelled me out of bed so swiftly that I nearly toppled the lamp in my haste, my heart already hammering, as if it understood something my mind hadn't yet grasped. Stumbling into the living room, I snatched the remote with trembling fingers, pressing the power button as the television flickered to life, its screen stuttering for a moment before settling on an image that defied comprehension. It was the local news channel, but the anchor looked dishevelled, beads of sweat glistening on her forehead, and her hair plastered to her scalp as if she'd sprinted to the studio, her voice wavering as she spoke. "Multiple reports flooding in from the industrial district," she said, faltering at times as though fighting the urge to shout. "Authorities are investigating an incident at Velder's propulsion facilities, though details remain unclear at this time, but—" She paused abruptly, her gaze darting to something off-screen, and I could have sworn her complexion drained of colour in that instant. "They're urging residents to stay indoors and secure their homes until—" The broadcast dissolved into static, a harsh, grating noise filling the room like the drone of 1,000 insects, leaving me staring at a blank screen, with my breath caught in my throat. I fumbled with the remote, my clammy hands struggling to maintain a grip as I switched channels in a frantic blur, only to find Channel 5 drowned in static and 24 hours, offering nothing but the same grey snow. A tightness gripped my chest, growing sharper as I wrestled with the confusion of what was unfolding before me. The television screen suddenly devoid of news broadcasts and replaced instead with bold white letters that throbbed rhythmically like a living pulse. "No one is safe." Without sound or context to anchor them, those words flickered in and out of existence, appearing and vanishing in an endless loop that held me captive, the remote dangling limply in my hand, while a shiver crept up my spine, its chill unrelated to the apartment's steady warmth. "Lasek," I rasped into the phone, my voice emerging rough and strained as I pressed it to my ear, desperate to understand what was happening, but the line had already gone dead. Either he'd hung up or something had severed the connection entirely. I jabbed at the screen to call him back, watching in dismay as the signal bars plummeted from 3 to 0 in an instant, the mocking words "no service" glaring back at me from the display, prompting me to let the phone slip from my grasp and tumble onto the couch while my gaze remained locked on the television's relentless message. "No one is safe." The phrase burrowed into my mind like a relentless intruder, and for a fleeting moment I could have sworn I heard a noise from outside. a low, guttural groan, almost human yet distorted, as though it emanated from something that shouldn't possess the ability to make such a sound. Rising unsteadily to my feet, my legs trembling beneath me, I shuffled toward the window, driven by an inexplicable urge, perhaps a need to glimpse something ordinary, something that might reassure me the world beyond these walls hadn't vanished entirely. When I tugged the curtain aside, however, the street below stretched out in eerie stillness, the street lights flickering in their usual rhythm, but illuminating no movement, no life. Just a silence that Ridgewood occasionally wielded like a taunt, though tonight it felt denser, almost animate in its intensity. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I caught a glimpse of something. A shadow that defied reason, its elongated form too unnatural to belong to any human, gliding silently between the buildings, before vanishing the moment I turned my head to focus on it, leaving me certain I hadn't imagined it, despite its fleeting presence. Behind me, the television continued its grim chant, "No one is safe," a warning I couldn't escape. And as I let the curtain fall back into place, my heart pounded with such force that it seemed determined to shatter my ribcage, signalling that whatever was stirring in the darkness had begun its work, accompanied by a gnawing dread that it had no intention of stopping anytime soon. I was dialing Lasek's number for what felt like the 10th time, my fingers trembling over the useless device, when a sudden noise erupted from the hallway, a heavy, resounding thud, as though something massive had collided with the wall just beyond my door. The phone slipped from my hand, clattering to the floor where its screen flashed, "No service," like a silent accusation, and my heart surged into overdrive as I froze, my eyes riveted to the door, while the television's warning pulsed on in the background, its message now less a revelation and more a haunting refrain. Then came the sound of footsteps, rapid and uneven, ascending the building stairs with an urgency that sent my pulse racing, and I knew it was him even before his voice pierced the air, raw and fractured as he shouted, "Dad, open the door!" Lasek's tone carried a desperation I'd never heard from my son, a boy I'd always seen as unshakable, a pillar of strength. Yet when I rushed to unlock the door, fumbling with the 2 bolts I rarely bothered to secure, he stumbled inside, nearly collapsing into my arms, his once sturdy frame reduced to a trembling wreck, clad in a dark, tactical uniform I didn't recognise, torn at the shoulder and streaked with blood from a jagged gash that ran from his neck to his chest. He looked nothing like the son I knew, his wide eyes reflecting not just fear, but a deeper, more shattering despair that chilled me to my core. "Lasek, what happened to you?" I demanded, my voice rising louder than I intended, as he seized my arm, yanking me back into the apartment while casting a frantic glance over his shoulder, as though something unseen pursued him up the stairs. "We need to get out of here," he panted, his chest heaving with rapid, shallow breaths. "They're coming. I saw them." Before I could press him for answers, his words spilled out in a torrent, as if holding them back had become unbearable, and he described horrors that defied comprehension. "I don't know what they are, Dad. They're not human. They're things, creatures, and I was on patrol near the complex when everything went haywire, explosions ripping through the silence as they emerged, moving fast and quiet like they already knew where everyone was. No screams, no warning, just people vanishing into nothing." His voice broke as he recounted how Sanders, a fellow officer, had been consumed, how the thing opened what should have been a mouth, a writhing void that twisted reality around it, folding Sanders into itself until he was gone, erased in an instant. I stared at him, struggling to process his words as blood dripped from his wound onto my worn rug, pooling into a dark stain that seemed to shift and breathe in my peripheral vision, amplifying the terror that gripped me. "They twist everything," Lasek continued, his voice dropping to a haunted whisper. "The air grows thick, time bends in ways it shouldn't, and I watched an entire street blur into nothing, like it was wiped clean and redrawn before my eyes. These things hunting us with a precision that suggests they've already mapped us out." Before I could respond, a muffled cry sliced through the air from somewhere within the building. Not quite human, its warped, jagged edge hinting at something attempting to mimic a scream without understanding how, and Lasek stiffened, his hand instinctively reaching for the empty holster at his waist. "We need to go, now," he urged, just as another thud reverberated through the corridor, and I turned to see Nevik staggering down the stairs, his face ashen and his eyes glinting with raw panic, an old backpack slung over his shoulder while his trembling hands threatened to let it slip to the floor. "Did you hear that?" he croaked, his voice barely audible as though he feared drawing attention to himself. "There's something upstairs in my apartment. I saw it through the peephole, and it wasn't a person. It was off, wrong in every way." Exchanging a glance with Lasek, who gave a curt, decisive nod, as if he'd already charted our course, I felt the weight of his resolve settle over us, and he declared, "We stick together," his gaze shifting to Nevik. "But we've got to get out of this city before they reach us." Nevik didn't protest, swallowing hard as he shuffled closer, his footsteps grinding against the floor in a way that struck me as unnervingly loud in the stillness, while I grabbed my jacket from the couch and shoved my useless phone into my pocket, fully aware it offered no lifeline now. Lasek was already at the door, peering into the hallway with a tension that made him seem like a taut wire on the verge of snapping. And when I asked, "Where?" in a voice weaker than I'd intended, he replied without hesitation, "The pier. There's a boat there, our best shot," his eyes never leaving the corridor as he motioned for us to follow. Stepping into the unknown with my wounded son and a neighbour I barely knew, I felt the crushing reality of my unravelling city, my home, bearing down on me. And as we moved, a sharp crack echoed from below, like the splintering of bone, prompting Lasek to fix me with a steely gaze and warn, "If it moves, Dad, they're already here." As we emerged into the hallway, a wave of damp, heavy air washed over my face, feeling almost like an invisible hand brushing against my skin, carrying with it an oppressive humidity that seemed to cling to everything. The building, which had always struck me as merely old and weary from years of neglect, now pulsed with an unsettling vitality, its walls trembling faintly with an energy I couldn't quite pinpoint or see, as though something alive stirred within its very structure. Descending the stairs alongside Lasek and Nevik, I couldn't shake the eerie sensation that something was watching me. Not from any single point I could identify, but from every direction at once, an omnipresent gaze that prickled my senses and left me questioning what was real. The city I'd once called home, Ridgewood, with its orderly streets lined by gnarled, crooked poles, no longer resembled the place etched in my memory, having transformed into something alien and unrecognisable as we fled through its fractured landscape. While sprinting alongside Lasek and Nevik across the shattered sidewalks, the air grew so thick and stifling that breathing felt like drawing in damp cloth, each inhale a laborious effort against an unseen resistance. Though the streets stretched out deserted before us, they lacked the quiet stillness typical of a late night. Instead, they brimmed with a deafening emptiness, a void that seemed to observe us with intent, its silence roaring louder than any sound. In the distance, buildings blazed with orange flames that flickered hungrily against the windows, tongues of fire lapping at the glass as if driven by some insatiable appetite. Yet the inferno produced no audible crackle or roar, only a vivid, throbbing glow that suggested a life of its own. Amid this surreal scene, muffled screams drifted through the air, faint and abruptly severed, as though an unseen force had muted them mid-cry, leaving an unsettling hush in their wake. Leading the way, Lasek limped heavily, his chest marred by deep cuts that oozed blood through the shredded fabric of his uniform, one hand gripping a knife while the other pressed desperately against his wounds, as if he could physically contain the agony threatening to spill out. "Here," he rasped through gritted teeth, gesturing toward a narrow side street that I could have sworn hadn't existed moments before, its sudden appearance adding to the disorienting haze that enveloped us. Trailing behind me, Nevik panted audibly, his backpack swaying like a burdensome load across his shoulders, his silence speaking volumes despite the lack of words, his wide, glassy eyes revealing he'd witnessed something upstairs, something so harrowing it had propelled him into flight, though I dared not ask what it was. Our running felt strangely off, the ground beneath my feet softening momentarily like mud before solidifying again, an unnatural shift that threw off my balance and heightened the growing dread gnawing at my insides. Against my better judgment, I glanced back once, a decision I instantly regretted, as the street we'd just traversed warped before my eyes, curving upward into an impossible arch, while the buildings flanking it tilted inward, as if poised to engulf us in their collapsing embrace. Time itself seemed to fracture alongside the landscape, my watch frozen at 2:13 a.m. its second hand twitching erratically between moments like a needle caught in a glitch, amplifying the wrongness that permeated everything around us. A sharp chill crept up the back of my neck, an instinctive warning I couldn't dismiss, signalling that something pursued us. Unseen yet undeniably present, its pursuit a certainty I felt deep in my bones. "Did you hear that?" Nevik murmured, his voice quivering so violently it barely carried, though I wished I could block out the sound he'd noticed. A low, droning hum that wasn't quite tinnitus, more like a whisper reverberating inside my skull, insistent and invasive. Moments later, a sharp, dry snap pierced the air, reminiscent of a branch breaking underfoot, repeating in a rapid, approaching rhythm that set my nerves on edge. Lasek halted abruptly, thrusting a hand up to signal us to pause, his gaze darting through the shadows as he growled, "They're here!" His words laced with urgency before adding, "Don't look, just run," spurring us into motion once more, our feet pounding against a surface that now seemed to thrum beneath us, as though a heartbeat pulsed within the earth itself. Though I couldn't see our pursuers, their presence pressed against me, a tangible force bending the air with an invisible weight, as if something tore through the fabric of space to close the distance between us. The droning hum intensified, blending with a wet, sloshing sound, like footsteps splashing through non-existent puddles, heightening the surreal terror that gripped me as I stumbled over a jagged crack in the street. For a fleeting, disorienting second, the world tilted sideways, the sky dropping below me while the ground loomed overhead, my reflection glaring back from a shard of broken glass. Not my own face, but a distorted version with my eyes, its mouth gaping and lined with jagged, uneven teeth, vanishing as I blinked and reality snapped back into place, though my stomach churned with lingering unease. "There!" Lasek bellowed, pointing toward a rickety pier that materialized inexplicably amid the rubble of an unfamiliar street, its warped, half-rotted wooden planks supporting a small motorboat tethered to the end, bobbing gently on the inky surface of a river that glistened with deceptive calm. Despite its tranquil appearance, I distrusted the water instinctively, every element here cloaked in deceit as we raced toward the pier, the boards groaning precariously under our combined weight. That sharp snapping sound rang out again, closer now, accompanied by an indescribable noise, like living claws raking across metal, prompting Lasek to leap into the boat first, a pained groan escaping him as he clutched the engine, shouting, "Get in! Now!" With a desperation that left no room for hesitation. Hurling myself aboard, I nearly capsized us into the dark water, my body landing heavily as Nevik followed, tripping and collapsing to his knees on the boat's floor, his waxen face drained of colour. Lasek yanked the engine's cord once, twice, and on the third pull, it sputtered to life with a roar that sliced through the oppressive silence, a sound as vital as a heartbeat in that moment. Steering the rudder with a firm grip, he propelled us downstream, icy water spraying against my face, yet our escape offered no reprieve, the air trembling with a vibration that suggested something had shifted too swiftly to be seen, a presence refusing to relent in its pursuit. Glancing instinctively toward the shore, I caught sight of a shadow that defied logic. Elongated, impossibly thin, slithering between the charred husks of buildings, with no fixed form, yet unmistakably one of them, its fluid motion chilling me to the core. The droning hum surged louder, the boat shuddering as though something massive had struck the water behind us, prompting Lasek to yell, "Don't look! Focus ahead!" Over the engine's growl, his command anchoring me as I forced my gaze forward, though a new sound crept in, a haunting, melodic wail that wasn't quite singing, its dissonant notes stabbing at my ears like needles, emanating from all directions, ricocheting off the twisted trees lining the river and rippling across waves that shouldn't have existed. Nevik pressed his hands over his ears, muttering incoherently beneath the cacophony, while I battled a tugging sensation in my mind, an urge to turn and face whatever stalked us, though I resisted with every ounce of will I possessed. "Hold on tight," Lasek roared, pushing the engine harder, the boat slicing through the water with a force that failed to drown out the piercing wail. The city receding behind us into faint pinpricks of firelight swallowed by the darkness. Yet the river offered no sanctuary, its surface shifting unnaturally against the current in places, swirling into inexplicable eddies as the air grew colder with each passing metre, the droning hum morphing into a mocking tone that seemed to taunt our flight. Casting a glance at Lasek, his face set in grim determination, his eyes locked on the horizon. I couldn't help but wonder whether we'd truly escape, or if this pier, this boat, was merely another illusion conjured by Ridgewood, a cruel snare laid before us in a game we couldn't hope to win. As we hurtled downstream, the boat rattling as though it might tear itself apart, I understood with grim certainty that those sounds, those entities, wouldn't release us so easily. Their pursuit a twisted hunt driven by sport rather than necessity, leaving me to grapple with the chilling realization that the worst was yet to come. A deep gnawing part of me couldn't shake the sensation that they had already claimed victory over us, an intuition that settled in my bones as the boat's engine sputtered, coughed and finally gave out just as Marina came into view. A desolate cluster of warped wooden planks and forsaken vessels swaying gently in the inky rippling embrace of the river's dark waters. Whether it was a stroke of fortune or its cruel opposite that forced us to halt, I couldn't tell. But the urgency of our situation left no room for debate, especially with Lasek's condition deteriorating rapidly. Blood seeping through the rips in his uniform, thick and dark like spilled ink, pooling on the boat's weathered floor, while his face, drained of colour, bore the hollowed look of someone being devoured from within by an unseen force. "We need supplies," I rasped, my voice emerging rough and strained, nearly lost in the oppressive stillness that seemed to blanket everything around us, swallowing sound itself into an eerie void. Nevik, clutching his backpack tightly against his chest, as though it were a lifeline, offered only a silent nod in response, his words having dwindled to nothing since we'd left the pier, a reticence that had grown heavier with each passing mile. Marina stretched before us like the skeletal remains of a forgotten outpost, the sort of place you'd glide past without a second glance, its few flickering lampposts casting feeble beams that failed to pierce the gloom, leaving patches of shadow that danced and shifted, as if alive with their own restless intent. We secured the boat to a creaking dock that groaned under our weight, threatening to buckle at any moment, and I steadied Lasek as he staggered out, his body leaning heavily against mine, nearly dragging me down with the burden of his faltering strength. "Stay upright, son," I murmured under my breath, though his only reply was a guttural grunt, his jaw clenched tight against the agony coursing through him. In the corner of Marina loomed a bait shop, its grimy windows reflecting the river's surface in fractured, mirror-like shards, distorting the world outside into something jagged and unfamiliar. "I'll find something to clean those wounds," I announced, though before we could take a single step toward it, a low rumbling growl sliced through the stillness, shattering the fragile calm. Another boat, larger, more imposing than ours, carved its way through the water, its engine's deep thrum sounding alien against the night's pervasive quiet, slowing as it approached the pier until I caught sight of the logo emblazoned on its side. Velchard Propulsion, stark white letters gleaming ominously in the dark like bared fangs. My stomach twisted into a knot, a visceral reaction I couldn't suppress. "They're here," Lasek hissed, his voice barely audible as he shoved us toward the shadowed recess of a shed beside the shop, collapsing to his knees in the effort, but keeping his gaze locked on the approaching vessel, his knife still gripped tightly in his trembling hand. 3 figures disembarked from the Velchard boat, clad in sleek black tactical gear, their faces obscured by visors that glinted faintly in the dim light. Their weapons unlike anything I'd seen before. Bulky tubes connected to tanks strapped across their backs, suggesting they fired something far deadlier than mere bullets. They moved with mechanical precision, sweeping the marina with thin beams of red light that spilled from their visors, scanning the darkness like predators on the hunt. "No signs of the subjects here," a woman's voice declared, muffled by her helmet as she consulted a device cradled in her gloved hand, her tone clipped and clinical. "But there are residual traces on that boat," she added, gesturing toward ours, and a shiver raced down my spine, cold and sharp as her words sank in. "Recent," one of the men replied, his voice flat and metallic, devoid of inflection, as though forged from the same unyielding material as their gear. "Search the shop," he ordered, and I felt the instinct to flee surge within me, though Lasek's icy fingers clamped around my arm, anchoring me in place. "They're not here for rescue," he whispered, his eyes glinting with a steely resolve despite his weakened state. "They're containment." Nevik trembled beside me, sweat beading on his forehead despite the chill that hung in the air, and we remained crouched there in the shed's shadow. My heart pounding so fiercely I was certain its rhythm would betray us to those methodical figures stalking the marina. But just as they turned toward the shop, the atmosphere shifted abruptly, growing thick and heavy, as though all the oxygen had been siphoned from the world in an instant. And then I heard it, a buzzing sound, deeper and more ravenous than before, swelling into a chorus of menace. The creatures emerged without warning, not from the river or the marina's edges, but from the very air itself, as if the fabric of reality had ripped open to disgorge them into existence. I recognized them immediately as Type 3, an instinctive certainty despite never having encountered them before, their forms towering and grotesque, larger than the entities that had pursued us through the city, with bodies that mimicked human shapes yet defied them utterly, their thick legs and feet rooted to the ground, arms bending at unnatural angles, and heads devoid of features, marked only by gaping, throbbing cavities that pulsed like festering sores. The buzzing emanated from them, a vibration that shook the wooden planks beneath our feet, and the Velchard team sprang into action with startling speed. "Type 3 subjects!" the woman barked, raising her weapon, and a stream of blue light erupted from its barrel, striking one of the creatures, though it merely tilted its head in response, as if intrigued rather than harmed. The man beside her unleashed a different attack, launching a shimmering net of energy that unfurled in the air, but the creature shredded it with a single fluid motion, the sound of tearing reality crackling around us. And then the assault began in earnest. I'll never erase from my memory the noise the woman made as the first creature seized her. Not a scream, but a wet, choking gurgle, as though the air was wrenched from her lungs before it could form into anything coherent, her body hoisted off the ground by an arm that stretched impossibly long, its fingers unfurling like tendrils, and then the space around her warped, folding in on itself like a shattered reflection, angles twisting into impossibility, before she vanished entirely, consumed by an abyss that hadn't existed a moment before. Her blood splattered across the boards, only to be drawn into that same void, leaving no trace behind, as if the world itself refused to acknowledge her passing. The remaining 2 team members fared no better, their resistance crumbling swiftly under the creature's onslaught. One fired his weapon, a bolt of electricity that scorched the air with the tang of ozone, only for the nearest entity to redirect the energy back at him with a flick of its head, his body collapsing as time seemed to accelerate around him alone, aging and decaying into dust within moments, a grotesque spectacle of rapid entropy. The last man turned to flee, but the ground beneath him fractured, not with the splintering of wood, but as though space itself had abandoned its integrity, and he plummeted into a nonsensical void, arms flailing desperately before silence reclaimed the scene, broken only by the buzzing that now seemed to mock us with its relentless cadence. The Type 3 creatures lingered briefly, their head cavities throbbing with an eerie rhythm, the air around them quivering like heat rising off sun-scorched pavement, though they gave no indication of noticing us, or perhaps they simply deemed us unworthy of their attention. After a time they withdrew, slipping back into the nothingness from whence they came, leaving Marina a tableau of ruin and stillness, the wreckage of the Velchard team strewn across the pier like discarded toys. "Father," Lasek breathed, tugging me back to the present, his voice faint but insistent. "We need to move now." He was right, and I hauled him to his feet, supporting his weight as Nevik trailed behind, his gaze still locked on the spot where the team had been obliterated, a haunted look etched into his features. The Velchard boat remained intact, its door ajar like a silent beckoning, and while Nevik kept watch, Lasek and I clambered aboard, my boots slipping in something slick and wet that I refused to examine too closely. Inside, the floor was littered with shattered equipment, strange weapons with cracked casings, monitors flickering faintly with static, wires spitting sparks into the dimness. But in the corner, partially concealed by an overturned crate, stood a communication terminal, its small screen and built-in keyboard still aglow with a faint, steady light. "Grab it," Lasek urged, his voice frail yet resolute, and I yanked the cable free from the panel, the device's cold, heavy bulk settling into my hands as the screen flickered, displaying a single line of text. Containment files, restricted access, Velchard propulsion. My heart stuttered for a moment, a jolt of realization coursing through me. This belonged to them. This was the secret they guarded so fiercely. "There's more here," Lasek muttered, fumbling with a compartment nearby, his movements sluggish but determined, as though driven by a final desperate surge of purpose. He reached into the debris and pulled out a shattered tablet with a screen that, despite its cracks, still flickered faintly with life, alongside a bundle of papers stained dark with something I didn't want to identify. Knowing we couldn't leave anything behind, I slipped the terminal into my jacket, tucked the tablet into my pocket, and handed the papers to Nevik, whose hand had finally steadied enough to take them after rejoining us. When he asked what those creatures had been, his voice trembled with an edge that threatened to shatter entirely. I could only listen, as Lasek responded with hardened eyes that betrayed no answers, admitting he didn't know but insisting Volhado did, which meant we now had no choice but to uncover the truth ourselves. As Lasek coughed, blood trickling down his chin in a slow, ominous drip, I realised time was slipping away from us, prompting me to urge him toward our boat while supporting his faltering steps, determined we wouldn't linger in that forsaken place a moment longer. While we made our escape, a faint ringing returned to my ears, almost like a murmur rising from the river itself, though I refused to glance back, fully aware, without needing to see, that unseen eyes tracked our every move, waiting patiently as I clutched the terminal, the one object that might reveal why we were being hunted. Once aboard, the boat rocked unsteadily on the river's surface, resembling a brittle leaf caught in a windless void, its engines silenced, leaving only the laboured rasp of Lasek's breathing to pierce the stillness. Stretched out in the stern, his head resting on Nevik's backpack, Lasek's chest wounds glistened wetly under the dim glow of the lantern I held aloft, illuminating his pallor in a way that made my stomach tighten with dread. When I asked Nevik to pass me the terminal, taking it from his reluctant grip, I felt its heft, cold and unyielding, its fractured screen blinking like the last gasps of a fading creature. And though every instinct screamed that touching it was a mistake, as if it belonged to a reality far removed from our own, I knew we needed the knowledge it held. Balancing it on the boat's bench, my fingers hovered over the keys with a hesitation born of unease, only for the screen to flare to life unbidden, casting a sickly green light that danced across Lasek's gaunt features. Although restricted access blinked in jagged letters across the display, pressing enter without a password or any prompt unlocked the system, unleashing a cascade of files that scrolled past, blending text with incomprehensible symbols that looked like a chaotic fusion of mathematics and fevered dreams. When Nevik leaned closer, his voice barely audible over the thickening fog curling up from the water, asking what we were looking at, I began reading aloud, each word landing like a blow to my gut, unravelling a truth I hadn't been prepared to face. The files bore titles like Project Veil Rest, Confidential Report, Velrada Propellants, revealing that they hadn't merely been constructing rockets or pushing the boundaries of technology, but rather tampering with forces that should never have been disturbed. Within the archives, descriptions emerged of rituals, genuine ceremonies involving salt rings, dark wax candles, and incantations my tongue refused to shape, intertwined with accounts of engines designed to rip through the heavens and esoteric equations meant to breach something far more perilous. As one passage declared that the unseen had unlocked a threshold, Lasek, his eyes half shut yet locked on the screen, muttered about portals, a theory the data confirmed with chilling precision, listing coordinates, dates and energy spikes that soared beyond any rational machine's capacity to measure. Every launch, it seemed, had been an offering, each rocket a spike driven into the fragile weave of existence, though the final entry, critical failure in Ritual 17, containment lost, permanent breach detected, sent a shiver through me that the river's chill couldn't explain, hinting at something that hadn't returned to wherever it came from, something that lingered here, accompanied by others. When Nevik, his face drained to a skeletal pallor, leaned in to ask if those things weren't truly from our world, I let the question hang unanswered, the terminal's screen flickering as though eager to show us more, opening a new file of its own accord with a low guttural hum that felt alive. As classification of extra-dimensional entities, types 1 to 4, sprawled across the display, I read aloud, my voice quavering with every detail that hammered another nail into the coffin of my composure, describing Type 1, minor extra-dimensional predators, nearly bestial, varying in size, hunting in synchronized packs, where speed and savagery offset their bodily frailty. Documented in urban zones, following the initial breach. Memories of the swift, tooth-laden shadows that had pursued us through the city flooded back, and realizing they were merely the least of these horrors tightened the knot in my chest. The list continued with Type 2, mimics of humanity, possessing unstable frames and drifting eyes that never settle in their sockets, exhibiting erratic actions and disjointed vocalizations that echo human speech, luring prey through deception. Conjuring an image of a figure I'd glimpsed on a street, its gaze shifting like insects trapped in a web that I'd dismissed as a trick of my mind until now. As the descriptions escalated to Type 3, entities of immense strength, capable of bending local space and time, their presence inducing sensory distortions and minor dimensional fractures, marked by unrelenting aggression, I recalled the marina, where gaping voids had swallowed people whole, and the air had warped like torn fabric, a sensation that lingered even now, miles away. When I reached Type 4, forms beyond human perception, endlessly adapting to their surroundings, wielding the power to reshape matter and energy on a colossal scale, exhibiting a shared awareness with an unknown intent, uncontainable since the breach. I paused, my breath trapped in my lungs, unable to fathom the sheer enormity of something so vast it strained the very space it occupied. Stirring weakly, Lasek coughed blood onto the boat's floor and urged me to finish, his voice faint yet resolute, compelling me to return to the screen where the final line struck like a gunshot. Conclusion: the degradation of reality is irreversible. Types 1 through 4, representing expressions of a greater power unleashed by the breach, all efforts to seal it having failed, with planetary evacuation recommended as the final protocol. Knowing they'd deemed it beyond repair, that they'd abandoned hope, Lasek insisted it wasn't over as long as we drew breath, though I glimpsed a flicker of terror beneath his defiance, prompting me to set the terminal back on the bench, its cold weight still clinging to my palms. Around us the river darkened, its currents twisting unnaturally, as though something massive stirred just beneath, and a sound, not the ringing I'd grown accustomed to, but a deep resonant growl, so low it reverberated in my bones, rolled from the direction of Ridgewood, where flames licked the night sky. Though my mind screamed that it resembled the fourth type, I couldn't bring myself to look, certain that whatever it was had begun to rouse, fully aware we'd uncovered a secret others would kill to bury. About 2 kilometers from the marina, the boat's engine sputtered and died, choking as if it had ingested something indigestible, leaving us no option but to seek a vehicle on land, which led us to a forsaken village that appeared abandoned long before the world had unravelled, its slanting houses, caved-in roofs and streets choked with overgrown weeds, twisting at impossible angles, painting a scene of eerie desolation. The air carried the acrid tang of scorched metal, pressing down with a silence so thick and oppressive that it seemed to settle like a physical burden across my shoulders. Lasek trailed behind me, his movements sluggish as the velvet-covered terminal dangled from his shoulder, its weight dragging at him like an anchor, while Nevik gripped the flashlight tightly, the trembling beam dancing erratically in his unsteady hands. We stumbled upon an old truck tucked inside an open garage, its paint peeling in ragged strips, yet the keys remained nestled in the ignition, glinting faintly in the dimness. I was fumbling with the hood, my fingers brushing against rusted metal, when the ground shuddered beneath us, not with the chaotic rumble of an earthquake, but with the deliberate, measured force of a single, monstrous step. Lifting my gaze, I saw her standing there, a Type 4, towering and unnaturally slender, her features eerily human, yet disturbingly alien. Oversized black eyes that absorbed light rather than reflected it, a mouth frozen in an unmoving line. She loomed in the center of the street, her presence warping the surrounding air as though reality itself bent to accommodate her, folding inward under an invisible strain. I tried to shift my feet, to force my body into motion, but found myself rooted in place, not out of terror, but because of her influence locking my limbs as though she commanded the very space I occupied. My mind erupted with vivid, unbidden images, cities engulfed in roaring flames, stars tumbling from the heavens in streaks of fire, familiar faces contorted in silent agony, images that weren't accompanied by sound or seen through my eyes, but rather thrust directly into my consciousness, as if she'd bypassed my senses entirely. Time seemed to congeal around us, the air thickening into something solid and unyielding, while Lassek crumpled to his knees beside me, clutching his head in desperation, and Nevik's flashlight slipped from his grasp, its beam spiralling wildly across the floor in a frantic dance of light. She didn't speak or stir, simply stood there, her fathomless black eyes consuming us, not with malice or aggression, but with an invasive curiosity, as though she were dissecting us from within, cataloguing every fragment of our being with meticulous precision. After an unmeasurable stretch of time, she turned and vanished into the mist, leaving behind a hollow void that ached in my chest, a lingering absence that gnawed at my nerves. We resolved to head for the military perimeter, mentioned in the files, a designated evacuation point, perhaps our last hope for resistance, and climbed into the truck, its engine sputtering to life as we set off along fractured roads that wound through the husks of lifeless cities. The world around us was grotesquely altered. Buildings melted into surreal, wax-like forms, street poles twisted into gravity-defying angles, trees frozen in petrified contortions, with branches that seemed to writhe in silent torment. While the sky overhead shifted colours with unnatural speed, flashing from blue to crimson, to an impenetrable black, as though it couldn't settle on its own identity. I gripped the steering wheel, my knuckles whitening under the strain, while Lassek pored over the terminal's flickering display, his face drained of colour, and Nevik stared out the window, muttering incoherently about shadows that slithered independently of any light source. The deeper we ventured, the more undeniable it became. Type 4s held dominion here, their authority evident in the behaviour of the lesser types we encountered, like the cluster of Type 1s we saw tearing apart an abandoned car, only to freeze mid-motion, as though summoned by an inaudible command, or the Type 2 that drifted past us on the road, its floating eyes and aimlessly swivelling head, betraying no intent to attack, merely trailing us with obedient detachment, puppets tethered to the will of their unseen masters. Hours later we reached the perimeter, a grim tableau of concrete barricades, charred tank husks, and scattered weapons that seemed pitifully inadequate against the forces we'd witnessed, where soldiers halted us, their lanterns casting harsh beams into our eyes as they escorted us into an advanced outpost. I craved answers, a sanctuary from the chaos, but a deep, ominous drone reverberating through the air warned that the Type 4s were already closing in, their approach as inevitable as the tide. The outpost buzzed with frenetic energy, a chaotic nest of concrete and twisted steel ringed by barricades that felt more like a desperate cry for survival than a functional defence, while soldiers darted back and forth, hauling ammunition crates and barking orders that ricocheted off the cracked walls. The air reeked of diesel fumes mingled with the sharp edge of fear, and the spotlights overhead flickered nervously, as though reluctant to illuminate the encroaching darkness. They ushered us into a rear bunker, its walls plastered with maps and a radio hissing static into the dimness, where Lassek handed the velvet terminal to an officer whose stern face bore a lattice of scars, his eyes carrying the weight of too many horrors. "Did you bring this?" he demanded, his voice rough and gravelly as he cradled the device like it might detonate, prompting me to recount, quickly and with a tremor in my words, our findings about Marina, the archives and the cryptic data we'd uncovered. The officer, identified as Colonel Harker by the badge pinned to his chest, listened in stony silence, his fingers tapping a restless rhythm on the table, before leaning forward as I finished, his face bathed in the terminal's eerie green glow. "Ex-Vela 9, he muttered, the name dripping from his lips like a malediction. That's where it all began. The experimental Velrado rocket launched 3 months ago, not merely a feat of engineering, but a vessel infused with an arcane ritual, a summoning circle etched into the launch silo itself, intended to push beyond the boundaries of space, only to breach the fabric of reality instead." My stomach churned at his words, while Lassek, still ashen and unsteady, propped himself against the wall, his gaze locked on the colonel, who nodded grimly when Lassek's faint but piercing voice posed a question. "Ex-Vala, 9 ascended, and something descended in its wake. The rupture you read about marked the genesis of this nightmare," Harker explained, gesturing to the terminal where the file still glimmered, revealing arcane reversal data harvested from those same rituals, alongside plans for a modified nuclear warhead inscribed with symbols, and charged with energy to mend the breach. Nevik, silent until that moment, recoiled a step, his face paling to a waxy sheen, and Harker regarded him with a flicker of pity before continuing. The warhead's being prepped as we speak. If it succeeds, the rupture seals, banishing these entities back to whatever abyss spawned them. But if it fails, well, you've seen the devastation they wreak. A shiver raced down my spine, the same icy sensation I'd felt in the village, intensified by the low drone that pulsed faintly here too, a subtle yet urgent harbinger that quickened my pulse. Nearby, a makeshift silo cradled the warhead, a hulking metal beast adorned with symbols that seemed to shimmer and bleed in the faint light, painted with a substance that defied the properties of mere ink, while soldiers swarmed around it, securing cables and shouting in unison as a loudspeaker crackled with a countdown. 10 minutes, Harker announced, standing beside us with binoculars clutched in his hands. If this goes as planned, we might all breathe freely again. The launch erupted with a deafening roar that shook the earth beneath our feet, the warhead soaring upward as its thrusters carved a fiery wound through the night, its inscribed symbols glowing like malevolent eyes piercing the sky. For a fleeting moment, I dared to hope, convinced it might actually succeed, until the heavens fractured, not with an explosion or a blaze, but with a splintering crack, as if the sky were glass shattered by a hammer's blow. A sound followed, a piercing wail that transcended mere noise, clawing at my ears and mind simultaneously, while the warhead detonated high above, unleashing a sphere of light, neither white nor gold, but a sickly violet that throbbed like a festering sore. The rupture widened in its wake, transforming from a narrow fissure into a yawning chasm, a void in the firmament that devoured the stars, and the air grew so dense I struggled to draw breath, the drone I'd sensed earlier swelling into a thunderous roar. From that abyss emerged the Type 4s, larger and more tangible than before, their forms grotesquely real, colossal beings whose bodies morphed as I watched, with arms elongating like liquid shadows, heads blending human traits with impossible distortions, and eyes blazing like beacons through a shroud of black mist. Their presence warped the very fabric of reality around us. The floor splintered beneath our feet, as if struck by an unseen force. The tanks encircling the area liquefied into molten streams resembling wax under a flame, and the soldiers, screaming in terror one moment, dissolved into ash that hung in the air, untouched by any breeze. They didn't launch an assault or raise a weapon against us, for their mere existence proved sufficient to unravel everything in their vicinity, consuming the world with an effortless, inevitable hunger. One of them shifted what I could only assume was its head, its gaze locking onto me despite the vast distance separating us. And in that instant, a torrent of images flooded my mind. The outpost engulfed in flames, the riverbed shrivelling into cracked earth, and my own voice echoing through an endless abyss that swallowed all sense of direction or time. Lasek's hand clamped onto my arm with desperate strength, his face twisting in a grimace of agony and dread as he bellowed that the people needed to flee, though his words barely pierced the suffocating silence, devoured by the overwhelming presence of those beings. Nevik stood rooted to the spot, his eyes stretched wide in horror, his mouth gaping but silent, as if the sound had been stolen from him entirely. The four entities fanned out across the landscape, transforming the ground near the outpost into a swirling mix of dust and shadow, while the sky above buckled and warped, resembling a sheet of crumpled paper under a careless hand. I seized Lasek and Nevik, hauling them backward with all my might, though deep down I understood there was no refuge to be found, no corner of the world left untouched by the collapse unfolding before my eyes, where those things stood as the harbingers of everything I'd ever known, crumbling into oblivion. The world shattered further when the warhead failed, its detonation useless against their power, and the sky, already fractured, broke apart into jagged shards that rained down like obsidian glass, while the earth beneath the military outpost split open, releasing gusts of icy wind laced with cries that bore no trace of humanity. Harker's voice cut through the chaos as he roared for evacuation, his command nearly drowned by the deafening clamour of the four towering Type 4 entities that devoured everything in their path, leaving nothing but ruin in their wake. Soldiers scattered in every direction, some firing futile bursts at the growing shadows that loomed ever larger, while others stumbled and vanished, pulled into sudden chasms that yawned open beneath their feet without warning. I gripped Lasek's blood-slick arm and yanked Nevik along with me, but a wiry figure with crooked glasses, Ellis, as I'd later learn, barricaded our path, clutching a velvet-encased device as though it were the last tether to salvation, shouting that we had to get it to the terminal at the extraction point. There was no time to debate his frantic plea, and Harker, pointing toward a shadowed trail slicing through the forest beyond the outpost, urged us onward, his voice rising above the din as he ordered us to a helicopter waiting 3 kilometers away, staying behind to bark commands while the perimeter succumbed to the encroaching madness. We bolted down the path, me leading the charge, Lasek hobbling at my side with a limp, Ellis trailing with the terminal clutched tightly, and Nevik bringing up the rear, his chest heaving and his eyes darting wildly. As the trail morphed into a living nightmare, trees contorted as though animated by some malevolent force. The ground quaked beneath our boots and the air thickened with every step, pressing against my lungs like a mask forged of iron. Behind us, the outpost blazed, its searchlights bursting into showers of sparks that illuminated nothing but the void, and we hadn't covered a full kilometre when a piercing ringing filled my ears, mingling with a deep, guttural drone that reverberated through my bones, signalling the approach of not just the Type 4s, but smaller entities, Types 1 and 2, emerging from the forest like a swarm of shadows and jagged teeth. Nevik halted abruptly, his face drained of colour yet resolute, and before I could reach for him, he declared with a trembling but unwavering voice that he'd hold them off, snatching a grenade from a fallen soldier's belt and charging back toward the encroaching horde, his final shout lost to the wind as a blinding explosion erupted moments later, briefly silhouetting their twisted forms against the darkness before they vanished into the gloom. My chest tightened with grief, but Lasek dragged me forward, insisting that Nevik had made his choice and we had to keep moving. While Ellis stumbled behind, the terminal rattling in his grasp as we pressed on through a trail now littered with soldiers, some sprinting in the opposite direction, others collapsing as dark voids opened beneath them, swallowing them whole and leaving only scattered boots or rifles as evidence of their existence. The sky no longer resembled anything familiar, twisting into a maelstrom of unnatural hues, purples and greens bleeding into a living blackness, while the wind howled upward, tearing leaves against gravity, and the ground softened beneath us at intervals, threatening to pull us under with every step. Lasek's shout to keep going rasped against the chaos, his voice a faint thread in the cacophony, and though the trail seemed to stretch endlessly before us, I knew that pausing meant certain death, especially as the evacuation zone drew near enough for me to hear the faint thrum of helicopter blades slicing through the air. Then it emerged, one of the Type 4 entities, towering above the treetops, its form too vast for the narrow path, its body shifting as I stared, legs bending backward in impossible angles, arms elongating like tendrils of solidified smoke, and a head that flickered between a human visage and a void studded with countless eyes. It didn't stride toward us, but simply appeared, the space around it buckling as though reality itself recoiled in protest, and Ellis dropped to his knees, the terminal slipping from his hands, as he fumbled for a small artifact, a metal cylinder etched with symbols, wired to the device, claiming it was an inverter based on some ancient ritual, capable of repelling the entity. He twisted a dial on the artifact, unleashing a low hum that pulsed through the air, but the entity remained unmoved, its presence thickening the atmosphere until my ears popped and the device sparked, its metal shell fracturing under the strain, prompting Ellis to cry out in despair that it wasn't working, as the creature tilted its head, fixing us with dozens of eyes that seared images of death and desolation into my mind. Then reality itself fractured, waves of distortion rippling outward from the entity, warping the world around us so that one moment I was sprinting forward and the next I stood frozen. Watching Lasek's scream loop endlessly, the sound trapped like a needle skipping on a record, while the helicopter materialized ahead, its blades spinning in sluggish, distorted arcs, and the trail repeated itself, trees collapsing and rising, the ground splitting and sealing in an endless cycle. I battled the crushing force bearing down on me, dragging Lasek forward as his body sagged, his shout to run finally breaking through the distortion. And though the entity advanced with an inexorable slowness that cratered the earth beneath its steps, Ellis vanished in an instant, consumed by a void that yawned open beneath him despite his frantic efforts with the artifact. I didn't pause to mourn, hurling Lasek into the helicopter's open door, his blood streaking the metal, and leaping aboard as my fingers scrabbled for purchase, the entity's presence radiating a chilling heat that scorched my senses even without meeting its gaze, until the helicopter lurched skyward at the last possible second, its blades straining against the oppressive air as we narrowly escaped, the ground below disintegrating into dust beneath its shadow. Inside the helicopter, the world beyond the windows no longer resembled Earth, unfolding instead as a grotesque tableau painted by a deranged hand. Mountains melted into slag, rivers defied gravity to flow upward, and cities vanished beneath a mist that throbbed like living flesh. The sky loomed dark yet teemed with presence, an immense, artificial structure hovering above, neither cloud nor star, its jagged angles twisting the eye painfully. And Lasek lay sprawled on the floor, his chest rising and falling in shallow gasps, blood seeping through his torn uniform as he clung to the velvet terminal, his fingers locked around it as though it anchored his fading life. He murmured that we'd made it, his voice faint but resolute despite the glaze over his eyes, while the pilot's shouts into the radio dissolved into static, leaving me staring at my trembling hands, caked with dirt and blood, grappling with the enormity of what we'd endured. The terminal remained our sole remnant, the data, the velvet's secrets, our only hope of deciphering the catastrophe that had engulfed us. Yet I wondered if understanding could alter the reality unfolding outside, where the world withered under the entity's touch, and we were little more than ants fleeing a boot that had already crushed the anthill. Then my phone buzzed in my pocket, a detail I'd forgotten amid the chaos, and when I pulled it out, its cracked screen flickered with a dim glow, displaying a message scrolling endlessly. No one is safe. Unlike before, it no longer flashed or pulsed with urgency, settling instead as static text, a silent epitaph etched into the device. No longer a warning, but a cold, immutable truth burrowed into what remained of my resolve. The helicopter shuddered, the entity's roars reverberating from below, and I tucked the phone away, its weight heavy as lead against my thigh, while Lasek's gaze met mine, his eyes dim yet defiant, a stubborn spark flickering within them as he rasped that as long as we kept fighting, hope endured, his words slicing through the despair threatening to choke me. I looked at him, my son, battered and half-broken yet still here, and gripped his hand, his blood warm against my skin, while outside the world sprawled as an open grave. For a fleeting moment inside that trembling helicopter, I let myself believe him, clinging to that fragile thread of possibility amidst the ruin.